Today we have a special guest on the show, economist John Adams, who's here to, catch up and share some of his perspectives on the economy, what's happening in the future, and some exciting things that's going on with him and chess. So I'll invite you onto the channel. John, how you going, mate? Thanks for coming on.
How are you going today?
Oh, just fighting with computers and things for the last half an hour. It's good, get you there waiting and all riled up so you can get excited. Get excited. It's all planned, mate. This isn't me just being unorganized. It's to get you annoyed. So, but other than that, really good.
So I was going to say, so today's the 31st of July, and I can't recall when exactly I was in your studio last. I think it was August of last year. So it's been 11 months, and a lot has happened in that time.
Yeah, no, it's been about a year, hasn't it? It has been about a year. I still haven't finished working on my house, but other than that, a lot else has gone on. So, the first question I wanted to put to you, and this is just something you mentioned in passing, is, the world I'm in construction, I'm on the phone to people, and they're saying, "Oh, how you going? Busy now? How's the pipeline?" And often, future work is getting a bit quiet. It's getting a bit scant. And when you're telling me some people still think that the economy is going to bounce right back, we're going to have that amazing V-shaped recovery, I can't see it. And the people I talk to generally, they're a bit worried too. So are there actually still people out there that think we're going to get that amazing, bounce right back? We've actually hit the trough of the economy. Everything's going to be good. What's your take on that?
So probably, around March, April, there was voices out there saying it's going to be a V-shaped recovery because there was this anticipation that this lockdown and the procedures that were putting in place around COVID-19 were going to be short-lived. But here we are 4 or 5 months down the track, and we still haven't fully opened up the economy, whether in terms of the domestic borders or the international borders, or have a look at Victoria now. You basically can't move around the state without a mask. And so obviously because to be honest, here's the thing. In March, it was obvious to me that the COVID-19 was not as serious as what they told us in the beginning. So Imperial College said that if unmitigated, 40 million people would die worldwide. The Doherty Institute told the Morrison cabinet that if unmitigated, 150,000 Australians would die. And so these were the initial reports, saying you had to take aggressive action. So by, I'd say, late March, because I wrote a 6,000 word essay for my website, by late March, it was obvious to me that these predictions were BS, and that we should be lifting the lockdown sooner rather than later. And I thought under those conditions, we could, return back to normal, and there would have been a bit of a hiccup, but it wouldn't have been that bad. But here we are, months down the track, and there's still restricting movement. A number of sectors in the economy are still being impacted by these COVID-19 measures. And obviously, the longer we go on, the worse it's going to be for a whole host of sectors that were tied to the bubble. So if you remember when I was in your studio about 11 months ago, and during that day we went down and had a look at the Gold Coast and Surfers Paradise, etc. One of the things I said was that the Armageddon thesis was based on the biggest debt bubble in Australian history at the same time that we've got the biggest debt bubble in the history of the world. And either basically one of two things was going to happen. Either the debt bubble was going to pop and we'd have some sort of deflationary depression, kind of like the Harry Dent sort of thesis, or if they continue to print and inject stimulus, they could try to limit or try to keep the debt bubble intact, but it comes with a consequence, and that's going to be in terms of the dollar. So that's why I've been saying we're headed towards stagflation, because they chose the route of printing huge sums of money, having unprecedented amounts of fiscal stimulus in terms of the federal government, in terms of some of these state governments. Obviously I don't see a V-shaped recovery now because they've had these lockdowns for too long. I've lost quite a few supporters, I think, on social media and maybe even the YouTube show because I've taken that stance. But it's clearly not as lethal as what they said. In my estimation, I think what has happened in 2020 in Australia is the worst public policy disaster since 1915. And why 1915? Because that was Gallipoli. We had thousands of soldiers slaughtered because we got off at the wrong point on the Turkish coast. And we basically thought we were Superman and we could run into machine gun, in terms of Turkish machine gun fire, and we got slaughtered in terms of Gallipoli. So that was a colossal military mistake. And I think this is the biggest colossal peacetime mistake in Australian history.
So you're saying you've copped a lot of, well, you've lost a lot of followers because of this, because of your stance or critical of, let's say, the government's restrictions on our economy to try and mitigate the spread of this virus. And I mean, I think it comes down to your perspective. We're both at that age where we'd be at a much reduced risk of morbidity, and we don't have the comorbidity factors that a lot of people do. I mean, I was talking to a doctor friend who managed to get out of Melbourne just a couple of months before everything happened. And, he was working back at house there. And in New South Wales Health, you've got to put a mask on wherever you walk around, or when you're talking to a patient. So he's going out to get a coffee, and he was the only one that wasn't wearing a mask on. He's not at all that worried about it. He's saying it's a bit of an overreaction. But even if you put that argument forward now, everyone's laying onto you into the media. You're looked at as a pariah. They're calling you a denier of this or that. They're really trying to focus just one angle with regards to the way, this virus is the end of the world. We've got to lock down the economies. To hell with our freedoms, to hell with the interventions, to hell with the consequences. And just looking at that, I really suspect that we're potentially seeing a mass hysteria play out one way or another on a global scale. And this fear can spread really efficiently through social media. And I mean, regardless of how it's looked at in history, the damage is going to be to the economy. And we're seeing it manifest here every month. The figures are getting worse. We've now got, apparently deflation, building approvals. Yesterday that came out, 8-year low for building improvement. And that's the pipeline for the construction sector when they're chucking everything they can at it. I mean, what's left to throw at it? I mean, I got two questions for you. One is with regards to deflation, if you could explain that to people, how the ABS got to that. And the other one, what else do you think they can chuck at housing?
Sure. Okay, so probably one of the main points I'll make to you, Florian, is that what we're seeing now, particularly with the extension of JobKeeper, so we're seeing politics now. What the government is doing has nothing to do with economics. It's all about political power. So if there was no stimulus, what would have happened with the lockdown? The debt bubble would have imploded, and basically would be in the midst of a depression. The banks would have gone bust. And so the banks control the politicians, and so that's obviously why they're printing and spending a lot of money. Now, they can't... So obviously, because I know that on your show you were talking about the cliff. And the cliff was if they stop the JobKeeper, JobSeeker in September and the banks start to repay, you'd have a cash flow crisis right throughout the economy, and a lot of people would not have the income to basically make their debt repayments, and that would have spelled disaster for the banks. So obviously now we've got an extension of JobKeeper going into March. I think Morrison is just throwing everything he can to ensure that he can win the next election. I really think it is that cynical in terms of politics, and he's willing to. So my two daughters, your children, they're basically already stuffed. I mean, the thing is so we're never going to pay back this debt. I mean, in terms of federal debt, we're at what, $700-800 billion, and it's still going to be racked up. And there is no plan to ever pay this back. And even if we were to unlock the economy and we went back to what we thought was normal, well, we can never go back to where we were at the beginning of the year, because the amount of stimulus that's been pumped into the system, we can never reverse that. So now, in terms of the question about deflation, so if you look at the key thing on this is, well, what is inflation? What is deflation? historically, going back to the pre-Keynes era, we're talking about the money supply. Do you inflate the money supply or do you contract the money supply? Well, just before we started recording, I looked up the RBA statistics on broad money, and we have the fastest growth in the money supply, as measured by broad money, since June of 2009. So we've seen a massive increase in the speed and the pace of the increase of broad money. So they are printing more and more money, and the money supply is growing at a faster rate. And yet we have this narrative around deflation. Now, how do they get to deflation? So we have free childcare because of the government stimulus, and they said, well, obviously because no one's paying for childcare, we'll actually include that in the statistics. Well, that's completely misleading, because we know that that's not a permanent change. Now, my youngest daughter goes to childcare. For a while there, we had free childcare, but we're starting to pay. So these statistics, by even including this measure of free childcare, that's completely a misleading thing. I mean, it's a temporary policy change that doesn't reflect broader economic conditions. And if anyone thinks we're having a recession with falling prices, that's not going to happen. We have a big debt bubble. They're printing like crazy to keep the debt bubble intact. It's I'm finding it super expensive to go out and do things, take the children out. I mean, I know that you gave me a bit of flack because I put out a tweet about Boost Juice, and I've put out some stuff about McDonald's and prices. But when you're going out and spending for a couple of kids' meals, and you're paying $20, $25 at Macca's or whatever the case may be, that says to you there is something wrong with the currency. Now, I know we're going to talk about gold in a second, but one of the points I'll make is, because a lot of Australians haven't woken up to this fact. So in the year 2000, if you, whether it's up there in Brisbane or here in Sydney, if you bought an ounce of gold, you'd pay about 250 Australian dollars. Well, today you're paying about $2,800 for an ounce of gold. Well, why has the price gone up 1,000%? It's not that gold is any more valuable. It's that the currency has been debased for 20 years because of all this money printing and the growth of debt and the housing bubble, and that comes as a consequence of the currency. And so you have a whole host of these bank economists, Shane Oliver, AMP, Koukoulos, Christopher Joy, Peter Switzer, all these people just saying use the printing press. Well, your background's German. I've read about what happened in Germany in 1923. There's a consequence to the printing press. The establishment doesn't want to tell the public what that is. And there's this completely garbage narrative around deflation. Well, there is no deflation, because the ABS statistics been cooked by including a temporary policy change, which is already reversed because people are starting to pay childcare again. Mm-hmm. And you look at the growth in the money supply, well, that's actually ramping up. And so we're going to have middle-class Australians getting squeezed going forward. It's going to be harder to afford in terms of all of the core things that you need to survive in this country, whether it's housing or food or rent or childcare, transport. All of those things are going to impact ordinary life. And a lot of middle-class Australians who have not taken precautions around protecting their purchasing power, they're going to be squeezed. And obviously the establishment is not telling the public, what's really going on. And people are going to be wondering why is it that I've got lower income in the next 12 months, but things are more expensive. That's the classic definition of stagflation. That's where I think we're headed.
Well, before we move on to precious metals and people protecting themselves, which is something I want to talk to you about, it's the point you made about the definition of inflation and how that's changed. If you could explain to the viewers when that happened, and why you're an economist, you're putting arguments forward, and then you've got other economists coming and going, no, he doesn't know anything, yada yada yada. And sure, it's entertaining to watch the arguments occur, but why are we getting these different schools of thought, and why are people looking at this going, this seems like it's insane? How can we just print forever and there be no consequences? So I mean, starting back.
So I think the key change when we started to look at inflation, I mean, a lot of this has to do with Keynesian economics. So John Maynard Keynes didn't focus on the money supply; he focused on prices. So the consequence of printing money is the value of purchasing power, which as a result means leading to increasing prices. So statistical agencies around the world have tried to measure inflation not by looking at the money supply, but they thought, well, obviously if by printing money prices go up, let's focus on prices. Now, one of the big scams and scandals in modern Australian history was the ABS has cooked the statistics. So one of the main changes that happened in 1998 when they reformed the consumer price index was they took land out. Now, so when you look at the housing bubble that Australia has, we effectively have a land bubble. So if you look at what is the cost of to build a house, excluding land, that has increased in price, but that's basically been under control. But the cost of land has gone astronomically high, and that's a result in terms of the money printing. So we have been lied to by the government for more than 20 years about the real state of inflation. Inflation is way higher than what Canberra is willing to acknowledge. No one in the press or academia or the banks or the RBA has ever sort of told the public that the numbers are cooked. But if I mean, you can just go down to the local pub or wherever the case may be, the local park, and just talk to an everyday Australian and ask them, do you think that do you think it's cheap to live in Australia? And everyone's going to say we have a cost of living problem. I mean, one of the ironies when I worked in federal parliament in 2012-13 was the government in the establishment was telling the public inflation is low, and yet when the Liberal Party was doing polling in terms of the Australian people and finding out, well, what were the key economic concerns that Australians had, well, what topped the list? It was cost of living. So that obviously indicated there was a disconnect between what ordinary Australians on an everyday basis are experiencing versus what the government is trying to tell the public. And the key reason for that is that as they've been printing money, a whole bunch of things are going up in price, and not all of them are included in the consumer price index. Now, there are some other the statistical methodological changes that the ABS has made to suppress the rate of inflation. But this consumer price index is an absolute furphy of a statistic, and people shouldn't rely on establishment narratives as to what is inflation and whether inflation is going up or down or deflation. People should just look at their ordinary economic circumstances and just think to themselves, is it expensive to live in Australia? Is it cheap? Are they getting ahead with their wages, or are they falling behind? And I think if you just did got some ordinary Aussies around the coffee table and had a chat, they're all saying they're falling behind, and that is because of the money printing. And obviously the money printing is the real inflation. So if you go back to the pre-Keynes definition, going back to sort of classical economics or even the Austrian school with von Mises, it all comes down to the money supply, and the ABS has been creating huge amounts of money with the commercial banking sector for the last 20 years.
So why is the classical economic definition of money supply as the measure as inflation, why has that disappeared off the narrative? Why isn't the media reporting that as well as CPI? It was just people aren't aware of it, or everyone wants to keep getting rich and rich and rich, and no one wants to burst the bubble.
So probably two things. I mean, the first thing is the university sector in this country is 100% corrupt. So you can't go to any Australian university and study economics and learn something other than Keynes. Keynes has infiltrated every university department, and obviously they're teaching all this standard BS. So I think that's one of the main reasons. A lot of journalists, I think, haven't actually, they're pretty dumb in terms of actually trying to figure some of this stuff out. So I don't think they have actually read the technical working papers of the ABS to figure out that they actually rigged the statistic, and that we're seeing massive manipulation of the official numbers. And then obviously we have the establishment interest. So who benefits from a lower CPI reading? is ultimately the banks. So in 1993, the Reserve Bank of Australia said that we were going to have inflation targeting. So that's how they're going to conduct monetary policy. In 1998, they said that they were going to do this inflation targeting using the CPI. So when did they come up with that decision? After they took land out. So by having a lower CPI, that effectively allows the RBA to have lower interest rates on the basis that we've got lower inflation, and lower interest rates has allowed banks to lend out more, and the commercial banks have made record profits, and the RBA has not been forced to raise interest rates, because the key component that's been driving up price as a result of the inflation, and that is land, that's not been reported. And so the RBA has been allowed to have this narrative of low inflation for 20 years. And obviously we've seen a massive run-up in credit and a massive run-up of real inflation at the same time.
But surely one can appreciate the consequences of that over the long term, that you can't just keep kicking that can down the road, that this inflation is going to build up, and it's manifesting in just pretty much just everyday punters, how much they need to put aside to save up for a deposit, even to get into a house. That reduces their spending, so it pulls back. It's going to have an effect on the economy. Or is the trick just to keep growing, bringing more people in, putting the bubble up and keeping it pushing and kicking it down until the next election? Is that the idea, or am I seeing the wrong thing here?
So that is all. I mean, that is the political strategy of the current government. I don't think the government can afford to actually come clean with the Australian people, but also in terms of reversing policy. Because anything that would result in the reversal of policy is going to implode this debt bubble, and we would have a depression. And that would wipe out the banks, and that would wipe out the government politically. So everything is designed to keep this facade up and to continue to continue the bubble going.
So I'm just bringing up, I know you can't see what I'm sharing everyone, but next to us I've brought up the Australian debt clock, which is just ticking up and up and up and up. So, but isn't it all going to be fine, John? That with now we've got this new advanced MMT, we can just print money forever. There's no consequences. Don't worry, just future generations will pay it off. Forget about it. Don't worry, just relax. I mean, what's your take on this? Because I'm seeing more and more articles appear, particularly on the ABC, where they're trying to push this whole MMT narrative. Now, is this just an old concept dressed up again with some new lingo and some more modern computational power, or is it actually something new and special?
Well, I think MMT is 100%. It is academic fraud. So the key linchpin of in terms of MMT is, how do they explain hyperinflation? And one of the key proponents of MMT in Australia is Professor Bill Mitchell from the University of Newcastle, and he tries to give some ridiculous explanation as to what led to hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, what happened to inflation in terms of Germany. So they basically say that in both cases you had a massive issue with the economy in terms of supply. So the supply of goods and services shrank. In the case of Zimbabwe, there was a massive fall in agricultural production. And then in the case of Germany, there was a fall in industrial production because of the Treaty of Versailles and a few other things like that. And that reduction in the supply of goods and services led to the hyperinflation. Well, that may have contributed to it, but that's absolutely not the explanation. I mean, we've had multiple episodes of hyperinflation throughout history. Venezuela today, obviously we've got Zimbabwe, and Germany 1923, Hungary 1948, even inflation in Germany after the Nazis were defeated. I mean, it was out of control, not as bad as 23, but it was still quite high. And even for the last 1,000 years, we know that when you print too much money, that creates a huge problem with inflation. And I think you were asking before about what are the consequences for the ordinary Aussie. Well, the ordinary Aussie is seeing a reduction in living standards, more financial stress, greater wealth inequality. We're seeing a surge in gold price. Silver's starting to move. And what's that saying is that the ordinary punter on the street. So one of the interesting things about reading German history and this period of 1923 is, if you lived in rural and regional Germany and you had a farm and you had some shelter and you had the ability to grow your own food, you were fine. If you had gold and silver, you sort of survived hyperinflation. But if you lived in a big city like Germany or Munich or Frankfurt, etc., and you just relied on your wages, you got absolutely wiped out. And obviously there was huge political ramifications of hyperinflation in some of these big German cities. And I'd say the same thing now. If you're living in Brisbane or Sydney or Melbourne and you rely on your wages, and your wages not keeping up with the cost of living or the cost of rent or the cost of buying a new house, you are now, obviously we don't have the rate of inflation that Germany had in 23, but we're on the path towards that, and a lot of Australians are struggling with their economic conditions, and yeah, there is no voice ultimately that's actually advocating for a new economic path. Every member of the House, every member of the Senate voted for the stimulus. There was not one person who actually talked about the consequences of too much debt earlier this year, or the problems around inflation. And we basically have a uniform consensus to screw the living standards of the average Aussie. And so far no one's actually took on the government in terms of an alternative political voice. But if history is any guide, people can take so much up to a certain point, and then you start to see an explosion of civil unrest and political violence, and whether it's even in terms of France and the French Revolution, what caused the revolution was the price of bread in Paris. So, or even the Arab Spring in 2011 with Egypt, it was the price of wheat. So inflation can lead to massive political unrest, and if we don't actually have sensible policies, if we don't get this debt under control, if we don't stop this monetary stimulus in the years to come, we're going to start to see some of these things bubble to the surface.
Well, I think you've an interesting point you raised there is one that a lot of people are starting to realize that their quality of life may not be the same as the previous generation. They may not reach the same, live the same quality that their parents did. The childhood that they can provide for their children, or they're waiting to reach the same level before they have kids, so they're just putting it off longer and longer and longer. So now you're getting a whole generation that isn't even stepping up, and then our population's growing down, so they start to bring in more people, and it creates this feedback loop. So if the average punter is copping it, with cost of living, and we can accept that that's going up. I know I gave you shit for buying a Boost juice. Well, that's just because every time I go to 7-Eleven, I buy the $2 hot chocolates for the kids, and with 5 kids, it adds up, mate. I can tell you that. I can't even go to Mac. I can't even go to Macca's anymore because it costs a fortune. It's like $50, $60 to feed the family, and it's all garbage anyway. But I mean, you've mentioned before precious metals, and I'll bring up, I'll just bring up the chart here next to us, which is showing the gold price, and right now it's at 1967. Oh no, sorry, 1969 US at the moment. So it's taken a big run up, and silver as well has taken a big run up. Now, you studied economics here in Australia, didn't you?
I did, yes.
What was, because if it's a Keynesian environment, and
yes.
What prompted you to maybe look at the other side, or look at an alternative argument? I found when I was at university, so long as you could, and this may have changed, so long as you could develop an evidence-based counter-argument, most of the academics or tutors would be fine, so long as there was a sufficient basis to your position. And I was quite critical of a lot of the greenwashing that we got in architecture. It was rampant. I'm going, well, you need to look at these things holistically and make a decision. And, in the years when I was tutoring, I started to see that disappearing from students. They just would blindly accept what they were told and wouldn't be interested. What was your journey to being, let's say the economic bad boy of Australia that's getting up there and ruffling feathers all the time and annoying the politicians and giving truth bombs to people? What was your journey to that?
Yeah. So when I was at university, so I learned the standard stuff, sat the exams, got my piece of paper. During that time, I was also reading a lot of different sort of books economics, politics, books about business. I was just a very curious reader. I continued to read a whole bunch of different stuff and listen to different voices post-university. Probably the GFC was a big turning point for me, probably because my economic training didn't give me a full understanding of why why the GFC occurred. And here's the thing, if you study economics and you're supposed to be proficient at it, you should be able to see a financial crisis coming. And basically, a whole bunch of economists worldwide were blind, and the standard economic stuff just didn't prepare people for that. So and also during that time, in particularly in 2008, Ron Paul, who's a former member of the Congress who ran for president, huge advocate of Austrian economics.
Mm-hmm.
I started listening to him and his arguments, and that got me curious, and I started on a path of trying to find the truth. And so when you're being fed a pack of lies and you've got a degree from a university and you realize that some of those things that you were taught don't stack up, you've got to go elsewhere and try to find, well, what makes sense and what stands up to scrutiny and evidence. And so obviously, that's where I sort of developed an understanding of Austrian economics and so some of the ideas that I've been exposed to at university, where do they come from and who was responsible and what was their background? Keynes a socialist, a pedophile, and a whole bunch of other nasty things with that man, and his ideas are being promulgated right throughout the university system. So I mean, it has been an evolution going through that system, and then obviously by 2016. It was obvious to me that we had a debt bubble, and I started looking into the statistics more, the official statistics, and obviously looking at historical things like Ireland and what happened with the debt bubble before the GFC, etc. And I just wasn't seeing anyone writing any critical pieces in the press. And so this is where I wrote a big piece for the Daily Telegraph in May 2016. Warning about the dangers of household debt, and a number of people read that and sort of caused a bit of interest. And since then, I've just been writing about. I've got effectively a very anti-debt message. One of the things I've learned, I think, over the last few years is why is it that Australians can sign a $1 million or $1.5 million or $2 million mortgage without blinking? I've come to learn is that economic understanding among the Australian people is quite low, but also people's understanding of risk. So I think a lot of people have a misconception about what financial risk is and what systemic risk is. Because if people thought it was risky to sign a $1 million mortgage, they wouldn't do it. So obviously a lot of people sign it because they think the risk is low. And obviously that understanding that risk is low has come from government, it's come from the media. You've got Koshi every morning on Channel 7 on Sunrise, pushing the agenda of the banks, pushing property. Why don't you get a loan? Time to get in, all of this sort of stuff. And all of these people are just paid puppets to push, a particular agenda. So, and obviously no one's talking about risk. And if you talk about risk, you call a doomsday merchant, a conspiracy theorist, someone who doesn't want to grow the economy, all of this sort of nonsense. And you've been how a lot of these people either don't get a platform to speak on the mainstream media or they get hounded out. And so this is where I think YouTube has been quite instrumental to give people like myself and Martin North and you an alternative voice to talk about a range of different economic matters and to provide an alternative explanation. And there's a section of the population that want to know the truth and have come to YouTube to find those people who know something different to the mainstream media. And we have these two universes, kind of like the Matrix. We have people who are red-pilled and who are awake to what's going on, and then there's a whole bunch of people who are still asleep, who sign $1 million mortgages thinking that there's no risk and everything's okay.
Well, haven't you heard, John? Property always goes up. It always goes up. It never goes down. Doubles every 7 years. Isn't that the line that I keep getting that in my comments all the time? You know,
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that I mean, when you have a massive run up in property, you do get statistical patterns, and people can just look at a short snapshot of time, and say, based on this short snapshot of time, you see this pattern, and therefore, if it's happened in the last 20 years, it's going to happen in the next 20 years. I mean, you can play those sort of statistical games and come up with those sort of lines now, like in terms of those lines about property doubling every 7 years. But you know, debt bubbles don't last. There are consequences to debt bubbles. It's either massive deflation or runaway hyperinflation. And yeah, so obviously I've taken precautions. And one thing I think is, because people may be listening to me and saying like Adams is full of crap. One of the measures I think is important to assess whether what you're being told is accurate or not is, what do people do with their own money, and how have people fared financially? So hand on heart, I mean, so when I was at your place last year and I said we've got this big debt bubble, well, I made sure that for a couple of years I've been completely out of debt. So paid off the house, got investment property, I've paid that off. And I took a number of precautions to ensure that my wife and my children were not going to be affected by an adverse economy or adverse financial markets. And I mean, there was a statistic that Martin North said on one of his shows on Walk the World a couple of months back. This was a private sector survey, and they said that 74% of Australians are financially stressed and anxious about the economy resulting from COVID-19. So obviously 26% were not affected, and I'm happy to say that I'm one of that 26%. So for those years I copped flack by mainstream voices like Switzer and Joy, I took a number of steps, and now when the crunch is on, the crunch we're facing at the moment, the crunch is more man-made because of the lockdown, as opposed to a bank declaring insolvency, and that was what happened in the GFC. But yeah, a lot of people are suffering. I've heard of suicide cases, people on suicide watch. I've heard of, I had a parent in Victoria call me up and said that he sent his 2 children to a psychologist because they're not handling the lockdown and some of the stresses around school. So there are people who are unprepared who are suffering. But for me, because of what I believe and what I've preached on your show and others, and the steps I've taken, I've not gone to sleep once in the last 5 months stressed about money, or that I'm gonna, I haven't felt stressed about putting food on the table for the kids, or how do I pay the bills. So there's a benefit to having a anti-debt philosophy, and to take a whole host of precautions, and to be financially educated. I think there's a lot of people who still are unclear about a range of core economic concepts, and I think it's very important that people continue to learn and educate and find those people who actually make sense, and to follow their writings or their commentary, and to implement their wisdom in your own daily life, because if you do that, you're going to avoid some of the prickly situations that some Australians are in today.
Well, the interesting takeaway from your experience really was the GFC was your never again moment. And there'll be a lot of people I'm encouraged that this situation we're in at the moment will be a never again moment for a lot of people. It may be the first opportunity that some people have ever actually had to step off the treadmill that they've been on their whole life. Just, following the same narrative, going along, need to get that house, need to keep up with the Joneses, need to pay for that holiday, I'll put it on credit, it'll all be good. And this is the first break they've ever had. And they may realize, I'm not happy with life. I need to sort this out. What am I doing this for? And I'm hoping it'll be a never again moment for a lot of Australians, and then we can get a positive out of this challenging economic times, because there are good, there are opportunities in everything, and including this, there's going to be opportunities moving forward. But I think it'll be painful for a lot of people. I think a lot of people are not prepared. A lot of people are going to be blindsided by what the actual risks they've exposed themselves to, and we've seen it all in the property spruikers. And that's one thing. I'll look at one article, then another on the same day, saying completely different things, or they'll be pushing a particular narrative, or it'll be like the ones that really get to me are the young couples that are so proud that they've paid like 100,000 above the reserve just to get in property now because, it's great to get in. And you're thinking, what chance are they going to have if we get hyperinflation and the value of the property is nothing, or we get it starting to fall down and it hits them and they're stuck in negative equity and they're struggling to make their repayments. So, how many Australians even have an emergency fund these days? None of them have. We're all living week to week.
So I would say I don't think many have. It's interesting. I had a phone call yesterday, but I've had a few phone calls where certain people who have watched me and followed my work, they wanted to have a chat to me, so we get them on the phone and we go through, their story. Some couples have debts in 600,000, 700, 800, 900, $1 million. I had someone last year call me who's got $1 million mortgage. And he listened to some of the things I had to say with Martin, and he wanted to pick my brain on some stuff. And so I had to pull him up, and I said, I just want to be completely honest with you. If I had $1 million mortgage, I literally could not sleep. I'd be stressed out of my brain. I wouldn't know how to function, and it would psychologically impact me having that amount of debt. And a lot of this comes from my parents. My parents had a very anti-debt philosophy, and where my mother got this from, it's a very interesting story. So my mum immigrated to Australia in 1977, and she came down to the Illawarra around Wollongong, and she made some local friends. And there was one woman who was in her 60s when I was a young boy, who used to come around and sort of visit mum and sort of visit me, my older sister at the time. And she had lived through the Great Depression here in Australia. And one of the things that she kept on saying to my mum, because my mum came here to Australia when she was 18, she said to my mum, if you ever get a mortgage, pay it off as quickly as you can, otherwise the banks are going to take it off you. And that was a message that Australian who lived through the Great Depression banged into my mum. And my mum came at 18 very naive about a whole host of economic and financial matters. And so when they got their mortgage in 85, they knocked it off in 5 years because of this fear of, if you don't get out of debt, there are consequences to that, like repossession. And so, having lived in an anti-debt household as a kid, I've taken that principle on as an adult, and I've got an anti-debt philosophy. So that's why I own my own house with no debts. And obviously, with my two daughters, I plan to preach an anti-debt philosophy for them, so we pass it on to the next generation.
One thing that's interesting is, did anyone foresee, and maybe this is just naive on my part, that the banks would just extend these mortgage holidays for so long and then extend them again and extend them again? Is this just, did anyone predict this would happen, that they'd just give so long holidays? They're going to get all the money back anyway. Was there any mention of this in the past? Any precedent?
So one thing that we can benefit Martin North with, Martin North for the last couple of years has been talking about he uses this term about unnatural acts. So there'll be all sorts of interventions that the regulator, as well as the banks, as well as the government, will implement to keep the bubble going and to prevent the bubble from collapsing. So the extension of the repayment holidays, that's an unnatural act, and it really just it says how desperate the system is, that they're saying that don't pay your mortgage for the next 6-9 months, whatever the case may be, because if you do, we know you're going to go bankrupt.
That should be the biggest red flag out there for the entire state of the economy, just that they're being that generous, because I don't consider them our friends at any measure, but still it's I guess now people are considering it normal, not paying, soon it'll be 0% down and no repayments for 40 years. It's all good. Just keep getting out there. But so
the thing is that so you can continue this for a certain amount of time, but ultimately there is a day of reckoning. And it's interesting because you said you're hopeful that people will learn their lesson. I dare say that some may have. I think a big chunk of Australians have not, and we need probably, it will take more economic pain to wake more people up to what's going on. So I think, COVID-19, if there is any benefit of the virus and what we've seen with the lockdown, it definitely has woken up a lot of people to particularly government power, and the power of the government to restrict movement and the ability to open up businesses and economic freedom. So you're starting to see a whole bunch of people voice their concerns where previously they didn't. I think that's a positive thing, but I think to fully wake up the Australian people, we need there'll need to be more pain, and obviously we know that pain's coming. So even according to the government's own numbers, I mean, unemployment is expected to peak in December, and I think about 9.5%. So that means that more people will become unemployed. But obviously, if JobKeeper was to end in March of 2020, you're going to start to see even more businesses and more employees be out of business, be out of work, and that will even compound. So going into the second half of 2020 and early 2021, it will get worse. And for those who were not prepared and can't take steps now, I mean, there are some people who can take a few steps now to mitigate some of these issues, and maybe they can soften the blow. But there are some people who just, for example, if you've lost your business and you've lost your job, and there's nothing to go back to, and you've got a massive mortgage, you've got nowhere to go. And you're basically stuffed. You've got to try to liquidate your sort of assets and hopefully that you can come out of the other side okay. And I should say there was an email I got about 2 weeks ago. A guy from Western Australia, he's been working for 30 years, wanted to be financially independent, bought 2-3 properties, thinking that was the right thing to do. Property market's fallen 35% in WA, and if he was to sell his whole portfolio, he would still owe the banks $80,000. And he said to me, he's worked for 30 years and it's all for nothing. And you're going to see more of that going forward. That's
gut wrenching, really. Just the prospect
Absolutely.
of that, and that's
yeah. The thing is, I mean, when I read this, I was telling a friend of mine in Melbourne, and who's a female, and I said that for a lot of men, when you get to your 50s and 60s, and from an economic point of view or from a wealth point of view, you've got nothing to show for it. Is that has huge psychological impact on men. And I think there was the Victorian coroner talking about how men in their 40s and 50s in Victoria are killing themselves in record numbers. I mean, so there's absolutely a direct correlation between middle-aged men who are economically destitute, who feel that their life is worth nothing, and they think that they're better off not being around.
Yeah, no, it's a sad side to all of this. I mean, you made one comment about more people being woken up, getting an understanding of actually how much political power our leaders have, how many restrictions they can impose on us on a day-to-day basis, force everyone to close down their businesses, restrict our travel between borders, and hopefully that will lead to a greater level of political engagement. I mean, we saw it with the cash ban. How many people did you talk to out and about that you mentioned it to that had no idea it was going ahead, or were shocked that it just sailed through the House of Reps without anyone listening to any of the debates?
Yeah. No, things like that was an interesting experience last year with the cash ban. It definitely woke more people up, and more people were engaged on that topic. So going to 2020, people are obviously engaged on a whole host of other issues, and a lot of people are not buying this about the seriousness of the virus. And so even on social media, I've already said, forget the vaccine. If there's a mandatory vaccine, I'm going to jail. I'm not taking it. So I don't trust the government. I don't trust Gates or Fauci about a vaccine. We've seen corruption around vaccines around the world. They put stuff in them that they don't disclose, and it creates all sorts of problems with children in particular, but also adults. Whether it's in the United States, in Africa, in India. So if there are vaccines that are properly tested, and other people take them, that's fine. I'll play ball with that. But if they're going to cut corners and just say we can't do a full 5-year human trial because we need to give everyone a vaccine now, because we need to get everyone back to work in 2021. If it's either the needle or jail, I'm off to jail.
It is concerning because historically a lot of the greatest disasters with this mass medication has been through shortcutting and through pushing it out fast and rapid deployment. We learned all the valuable lessons from that because people died. You can just have a look at all the birth defects that happened in Germany, where certain medications were still being handed out, and in other countries they were not. So, yeah, I'm leaning towards being quite concerned if they're going to push this out too quick. If they're going to push it out too quick, because again, I suspect that it's quite an overreaction, really, and frankly, I'd rather take my chances. Being the age I am. The obesity level I have, I'll just manage that rather than risk something that hasn't been proven. But, if they force you to do it, then you're right. They'll send you to jail. That'll be another thing they can... I think you can't actually refuse in the States. That's come out too, so they can force you to take it over there. That's what I've heard in passing. It'll be interesting times.
Yeah.
So, getting back to how people are preserving their wealth, and I'll just bring up the gold price here and the silver price. We'll have a look at that. What are your predictions for gold and silver? Because were you always a gold and silver bug, or did this only come about from your GFC experience and you're starting your wider reading and education?
Yeah. So in terms of me, I've only been buying bullion for 4 years. So the more I got educated about Austrian economics and the role of the monetary system, gold and silver, that education, that philosophy led me to start buying silver in particular. And I've been working in the industry for about 2 years. So I'm a chief economist for South Australia's largest bullion dealer. We have customers right across Australia coming to us to get the physical gold, silver, platinum, storage, insurance, all that sort of stuff. We have international clients as well that sort of contact me looking for help in terms of preserving purchasing power. So I've gone quite aggressively into silver myself because I don't trust the Australian dollar given what the RBA is doing. So in terms of prediction of price, now what I will say, so we won't go into a lot of detail in this conversation, but on my website I've written a lot of six detailed articles this year about the silver market. If people want to learn more, feel free to go on my website, have a bit of read. They're all for free. I suspect we're going to see very high prices relative to where we are now, and there's a range of reasons for that, but perhaps that's a conversation for another time.
I've brought up your website here to show everyone, and I'll link to that in the comments below so they can have a look at that. Essentially, this is a strategy just to preserve your wealth, to counter the effect of the rampant money printing on diluting your purchasing power.
In effect, yeah.
And, one thing we'll finish up on, hopefully a little bit more lighthearted than some of the topics we've been discussing, is Chessgate. What happened there? Did they really call you up asking if chess is racist? I can see it's fantastic. At least the ABC is trying to milk some money out of these social justice idiots that'll click on it, and everyone else will click on it thinking ABC can't be that stupid. But then again, maybe they can. So we'll click on it, and they're getting all the hits. They're getting the impact. So give us a brief overview of what happened there, if you could, John.
Well, so I was at home in front of the computer working away, actually writing my submission to the parliamentary inquiry about bail-in, and I get a phone call. And a producer from the ABC calls me up because I used to be involved in the Australian Chess Federation, and they basically said that they wanted to have a conversation about why white goes first and whether that is appropriate given the current environment and the current racial context. So they didn't use the explicit words, we think chess is racist, but they effectively implied it. Why would you want to change the rules because of the current context? I thought this was completely BS. And so, I just said no longer involved in chess, official chess circles, let me pass you on to someone else. So that other person went on the show and actually did the segment with James Valentine. I put out a tweet, because here's the thing. So if the private sector does this, well, I don't have to consume their product. But when the ABC does it, I have to pay for it. and I don't want to pay for this. And now, if other people want to pay for it, well, fine, they can pay for it, but I don't want to pay for it. So that's why I basically voiced my protest on social media, and it got retweeted, particularly by a Sky News presenter, and then it had a life of its own and ran rampant in the Daily Telly, and I was on 2GB and 2SM and Sky News, and I was on Russia Today, went on Russian TV, and Fox News talked about it, and London Telegraph, Jerusalem Post, Breitbart, even it hit Alex Jones's InfoWars, and Dave Light talked about it as well. So it created a big international stir, and Media Watch covered it and tried to obviously defend the integrity of the ABC. But there are big issues that the ABC should be focusing on and telling the public the truth, but they're wasting airtime talking about garbage like this. And they said they wanted to create fresh conversation. I mean, well, create fresh conversation on your own money. I don't want to pay for it, and a whole bunch of other people don't want to listen to this. I mean, so it was. I mean that's how it all sort of went down. Things like who would have thought that a 90-second phone conversation could lead to a big international story? But there you go.
It's funny that, isn't it? How far? I mean, it's just so stupid a concept, but it probably has worked for him. It's generated the interest and the clicks and the impact, and hopefully it's help expose some people to your profile around the world that could learn something from that. So there could be a positive to it. I'm trying to find a silver lining here, John. I'm trying to find one in the stupidest question in the world, but I mean it's the ABC, so I guess you're right. Well, no, I'd say thank you very much for your time today. It was a great chat catching up, and we'll have to do it again, hopefully not in a year's time. And I'll make sure to get my setup working a bit easier so we don't have as long to wait. But it's good to get you fired up and annoyed, I reckon. Get you going a bit more.
Good. No, yes. So hopefully between now and the end of 2020, I will be making my way up to Brisbane in one form or another. So if I am, hopefully we can be live in studio with you.
Definitely, we'll do it in person next time. Take care, John. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, mate.
See ya.